4, day 1, we're starting out Unit 4, talking about Thomas Jefferson. And you're going to see Thomas Jefferson, one of my favorite characters in U.S. history, and one of my favorite presidents. And we left off with the election of 1800, which marked the first peaceful transition of power between political parties. Jefferson would call this the Revolution of 1800 because of the vast change that it would bring in government. Over the next 24 years, when you're going to have Republican presidents. By the end of this time, the Federalist Party will cease to exist. So let's jump in to Jefferson's presidency and what that looked like. So, like I said, Jefferson called this the Revolution of 1800, and this started what was known as the Virginia dynasty of presidents. You have Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Each one of them would serve 2 terms, and they were able to revise a lot of the Federalist policies and encourage Western expansion. So basically, this is Jefferson's time to implement all of these visions that he saw for what government should and could be. Now, Jefferson's presidency, when you take a very broad view of it, and look at it and what he was able to accomplish. So for one, he maintained the national bank and the debt repayment plan of Hamilton. So he kept that in place. And if you remember where I mentioned last time, when the election of 1800 was in the House of Representatives, that's one of the suggestions that John Adams made to Jefferson was, hey, reassure the Federalists that you're going to not mess with these things that they hold very close, something like the national bank. Jefferson said that he wouldn't be he would enter office unencumbered by making promises such as that. But even though he didn't mess with the bank at all. He did carry on the neutrality policies of Washington and Adams, so trying to avoid involvement in foreign wars with France, with the French Revolution and everything that was going on there. But you are going to see that he does remain loyal to the policies of a Democratic Republican, which makes sense because he's kind of the head of that party. They wanted a limited government. They wanted to reduce the size of the military, at least of the standing military. And again, we have a much different view when you talk about the military and a standing military than they did back then. Now we're kind of in a perpetual state of having our military all out all around the world doing different things. Back then, that wasn't the case. So it was seen that when you were not in war, you didn't need to have a large standing army, and that if war did come, then that is when you would have your big army. He did eliminate some federal jobs. He repealed all excess taxes, including the one on whiskey. You're going to see that under Jefferson, pretty much all internal taxes would be eliminated. The only tax that you would really have is the tariff. Despite that happening, he was able to lower the national debt, so to pay down on that. And of course, he would only name Republicans to his cabinet. And again, that's a hallmark of presidents to this day, is that generally you're only going to pick people for your cabinet that have a similar ideological view to you. And that's what Jefferson did. So Republican changes. He comes into office, and Congress, of course, would brand the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional. The Naturalization Act would be amended to return to its original time frame. So all of that stuff that Madison had, or that John Adams had signed, all of that would be gotten rid of. And this was seen as very, very important because, again, remember the Republicans charged that the Alien Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, which I tend to agree with them that they were. They limited people's First Amendment freedom of speech. Also, all internal taxes would be abolished. And again, like I said at the beginning, the national debt would be reduced by $38 million, which is nearly half. And again, today we're in a day of almost getting close to $30 trillion in national debt. So it's crazy to think that during this time that the national debt, after Jefferson's time in the presidency, it'd be around $40 million. Size of the permanent army, again, reduced. And you will see the Judiciary Act of 1801 would be repealed, ousting 40 of Adams' midnight appointees. And what these midnight appointees were is that right up to the point that Adams was leaving office, he was signing appointees to the judiciary, again, so you could get those Federalist judges in there that are going to interpret the Constitution in the way that he thought it should be interpreted. Jefferson and Congress would repeal that Judiciary Act, which had been pushed through at the last minute. Literally, Jefferson's coming into office and they're pushing this to pass that. That would be overturned, getting rid of those midnight appointees. And you can see down here, when you look at the election years through 1806, that the House and the Senate, Congress in whole, is going to be fundamentally changed. When Jefferson comes into office in 1800, you're going to see that led to a broad sweeping victory for the Democratic Republicans. They would take over both the House and the Senate, and that would continue throughout the rest of the time. And you're going to see by 1806 that over 80% of the House and the Senate is made up of Democratic Republicans. But still, you had the Federalist courts in place, and this would be something that to Jefferson would be a thorn in his side throughout his presidency. Because remember, if you elect a judge, that judge is in there, or if you nominate a judge, that judge is in there for life. And the national judiciary was full of Federalists, including Chief Justice John Marshall. John Marshall was actually a cousin of Thomas Jefferson's. They did not get along, though, because of their extensive policy disagreements they had between the two sides. And we already mentioned that Adams, despite this Judiciary Act of 1801 getting passed, that Adams filled those positions that would be overturned. But you can see this Jefferson quote here. He said that Federalists have retired into the judiciary as a stronghold, and from that battery, all the works of republicanism are to be beaten down and destroyed. That's how important, and that's how he saw the court, again, having this Federalist court, what it meant for republicanism during that time. And probably one of the first cases that you're going to see where the Federalists exert their power and where John Marshall, as Chief Justice, exerts his power is in the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. What had happened with this is, again, these midnight appointees that Adams had made. One of them would be Judge Marbury. Basically, Adams or Jefferson and Madison, his Secretary of State, they get into the presidency, and they realize that not all of these appointments that Adams had made it to all the people. Basically, because they were rushing to do it at the last minute, not all of them got to the right people. They saw the appointment for Marbury and basically tore it up and threw it away. Marbury would sue Secretary of State James Madison, would sue him, and he would sue him because of not getting that position to the court. It would go all the way to the Supreme Court. And then John Marshall, in this landmark decision, he would put forth the principle or the idea of judicial review. He said, "Is it emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is?" And this is where he comes up with the idea, John Marshall does, that the president and Congress can do an act that is considered unconstitutional. And he said that what Jefferson and Madison had done in this situation was unconstitutional and that they were not allowed to do that. Now, when you're looking at the actual dynamics of the case, Marbury didn't get his position, remember, because the Judiciary Act would be overturned as it was. But still, this principle is set forth of judicial review, and that's still something that is a vital function of the court today. And that's why you see such a fight for Supreme Court justices, is because of this idea of, justices are in there for life and they have the power to overturn a law. I remember after Obamacare was passed, that everybody was kind of like, well, let's wait and put this on hold and let's see what the court says and how they will rule on Obamacare and if it is constitutional or not. So the court does wield a lot of power as that is concerned, and that's why people put such a big stake in Supreme Court justices and the like. So you do have an article to read about, was Jefferson a great president? It's going to talk a little bit about his presidency. So now we're going to move into talking about westward movement. Again, remember Jefferson was very much for agriculture and people farming, and he saw people moving west as very, very important because there was a lot of land out there and that people should move out there and should farm. And that's why you're going to see the Republican Congress is going to make it a lot easier for farm families to acquire land. Whereas the Federalists had raised the price on farmland, the Republicans would continually throughout Jefferson's presidency and Madison and Monroe do whatever they could to reduce the price of land out in the West. And you'll see by 1820, farmers only needed about $100 cash to buy 80 acres in the West, which again, this really does push and promote that view of Jefferson having of us being a nation based in agriculture. Under the Treaty of Paris after the American Revolution, you're going to see that Great Britain had relinquished its claims on basically the whole Appalachian region. And this meant that the care of the Indians and how to deal with the Indians was left to Americans. And of course, the way that Americans cared for Indians was continuing to push them off their land as Americans continued to settle farther out west. Now, Americans were divided on this issue. Some wanted to destroy the natives in their communities. Some thought that the best way to deal with the natives and the Indians was assimilating them into American society. And you're going to see throughout American history that different Congresses, different presidents are going to have different views on how to handle the natives. But really, in the end, they just got pushed off their land so that Americans could have that land instead. So, whose land is it? The U.S. government asserted their rights to ownership of the Trans-Appalachian West, basically all that territory to the Mississippi River. Of course, Indians would reject this claim, but the U.S. military and U.S. commissioners were able to use the threat of military action to force Indians to give up land in New York and Pennsylvania. Sometimes they were able to bribe Indians with liquor and that kind of thing to be able to get more acres. And eventually, you're going to see the Iroquois tribe becomes a small tribe because of the warfare and certain things that happen, and of course, still continuing to deal with disease. And these same tactics was to be used in the West as well when dealing with the natives and being able to try to get their land. So battle with Indians, you will see during Washington's presidency, he did battle with the Indians. He had sent forces to Ohio to confront the Indians there. Forces would actually be defeated there. And in response to that, Jefferson would double the size of the army. With that new larger army, they would go on to defeat the Indians in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. You would still have resistance, but again, this Indian resistance wouldn't be as large scale and it wouldn't be as organized as it had been in the past. And with the Treaty of Grenville in 1795, the U.S. did acknowledge that the Indians did own some land, but Indians did give up a lot of land that they had in Ohio and areas around the Great Lakes. And the Western Confederacy of Indians would agree to place themselves under protection of the U.S. And of course, this treaty would lead to devastation for the Indians, again, as they would continue to lose land as Americans move out to the West. A movement from the South. 1790 to 1820, you're going to have people that are leaving the South to move out to the western part of the United States. 1790 to 1820, you'd have the first wave, which would be white tenant farmers, yeoman families that would move west through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky and Tennessee. The Cumberland Gap, if you've ever been in Virginia, you go to basically the point of where Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky meet. That is where the Cumberland Gap is. It is a gap in the Appalachian Mountains that makes a good place to go through so that you don't have to climb a mountain. I got to visit there this summer. It's a very, very cool place to go to. Lots of hiking and that kind of stuff there. But this was a path that had been known about for Indians for quite a while. But Daniel Boone is going to be one of the first to actually lead people through that Cumberland Gap. Some, after going through the Cumberland Gap, they would move across the Ohio River and go into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And again, they were desiring to move because they wanted more farmland, especially your poor farmers. If you think about how many plantations that there were in the South in certain areas, they hoped to move west to be able to get their own large chunk of land. The second wave, you'd start having some slave-owning plantation owners that would move from the Carolina coast into the deeper South, again, looking for more land to farm and hopefully more land for them to farm so that they could create large plantations out there. And you would see an increase in the slave trade until 1808 when Congress actually cut off the slave trade. As people moved out west, though, and set up these slave-based plantations, they needed more slaves, and that is why you saw an increase in the slave trade until it was outlawed. Now, you would see technological advances during this period as well. Water-powered spinning jenny, other things that had been kind of imported over from Europe to help in the production of cloth and wool and all of that. But really, the big invention that you're going to see that's going to have the biggest impact is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. If you don't know anything about picking cotton and what that whole process is, when you pick cotton, it's actually full of these very little black seeds. So when planting cotton for a cotton farmer, they had to keep that in mind, and it limited the amount of cotton that they could plant because it was a very time-extensive process picking out those black seeds. What Eli Whitney's cotton gin did is you could put it in there, roll the cotton through, and it would use these forks to help pull out those seeds. Now, you would think wow, that would reduce the need for slaves because no longer did you need them picking out the seeds from the cotton. But actually, it increased the need for slaves because now plantation owners and cotton growers, they could plant a lot more cotton. And that's why you're going to get to the point where cotton is going to be known as King Cotton because of the massive cotton farms that you have and because of how much wealth that was bringing into the South and the country as a whole, because a lot of times that raw cotton would be shipped up north and be produced into clothing, which then could be shipped throughout the world. You would also see a lot of people leaving New England as well to move out west in pursuit of farming lands and that kind of thing as well. So you're having a lot of people move out to the western part of the new United States so that they could farm. So with this, we get to the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon had been very aggressive in his actions in North America, and it began to concern Jefferson. And the concern was that Napoleon might move to close down the Mississippi River. If you remember, New Orleans during this time still is largely under French control. So Jefferson would send Robert Livingston to France to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans with them. Now, Napoleon at this time was undergoing a massive amount of pressure. The war debt had really built up for France during this time, and he was left with wondering what to do. So Robert Livingston gets there, and again, the plan was to negotiate just to maybe get use of New Orleans, maybe the Mississippi River, and a little bit of territory. And Livingston gets there, and Napoleon and his people offer to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million, which is a steal. I think it equaled out to be somewhere near 3 cents an acre that they were willing to sell this. And Jefferson, Jefferson very much wanted this because, again, this fit in with his view of what the future would be in agriculture. And he also see it very important in doubling the size of the country, expanding the size of our country. The problem for Jefferson, though, is, again, he was a strict constructionist, and he believed that in order to purchase this land, that it needed to go through the process of Congress, possibly even going through the Senate, because there would be some sort of treaty in order to purchase this land. Now, his advisors came to him, and pretty much all of his advisors were on the other side of this and said, no, you don't have to worry about going to Congress and purchasing this land. This is under your powers of the presidency. You can purchase this land and double the size of this country. So this is a situation, again, where Jefferson goes with his advisors who were telling him, hey, you don't have to get the approval of Congress. And Jefferson doesn't get the approval of Congress and decides to purchase the land. Now, you might be wondering, again, Napoleon, why would he willingly give up all this land? You had to think that it was in Napoleon's mind that eventually one day he would be able to take back that land from the United States. In fact, a lot of historians believe that was his end goal in this, was to short-term finance his wars and eventually be able to take this land back from the United States. So Jefferson purchases the territory and, again, effectively doubles the size of the country overnight, which is absolutely incredible. Again, Jefferson and most Americans strongly approved of the Louisiana Purchase, and they liked the idea of that. Like I said, Jefferson had been committed to a strict interpretation of the Constitution and did not like the idea of implied power. And despite that, he goes ahead with what be considered a loose constructionist view of the Constitution to make this purchase. The Senate would approve this purchase, with Jefferson saying that it fell under the president's ability to make treaties, which again, treaties have to be approved by the Senate. So that's how Jefferson was able to justify that. Now, Jefferson would appoint Lewis and Clark, two old friends of him. I believe it was Meriwether Lewis that was actually from Charlottesville, Albemarle area, which Jefferson would have been very familiar with because that's where Monticello is. And he appoints them to go out west and to travel through this territory. And really, Jefferson, amongst his many interests, he was very interested in nature and observing nature and that kind of thing. And that's what he ordered them to do. And you can see here on their trail, they actually go fully all the way to the Oregon Territory into the Pacific, or make it to the Pacific Ocean. Again, the Oregon Territory during this time is still considered British territory, but they go ahead and explore all the way to there anyway. Of course, the Indian Sacagawea, she would assist Lewis and Clark on their journey as well, help negotiate with them, help them talk to the various Indian tribes, and she deserves a lot of credit for what she did in helping them in their journey and helping them as they encounter these different native tribes. So that brings us to Hamilton and Burr, and I love this meme here. You can call me Aaron Burr, by the way. I'm dropping Hamiltons. And if you've ever, for me, I grew up in the 90s, and there was a Got Milk commercial on that featured the question of who killed Alexander Hamilton. So growing up, everybody knew when I was a kid who killed Alexander Hamilton because of that commercial. But in 1804, you're going to see the Democratic Republicans decide not to nominate Aaron Burr for a second term as vice president. All the difficulties in the election of 1800, the fact that Aaron Burr knew that he should be vice president and Jefferson should be president, but he continued on in pushing that he would get the presidency. That was fresh in people's mind, the Democratic Republicans, and they said, look, we don't want Aaron Burr to be vice president anymore. And so you're going to see at this point, Burr becomes a little bit unhinged, actually a lot unhinged. You can see the election of 1804 poster there for Jefferson and Clinton, who would be running, not Bill Clinton, George Clinton, who would be running during this time. But so in response to the Louisiana Purchase, you're going to see that some New England Federalists start talking about secession. Why would they talk about secession? Well, the New England Federalists saw this as taking away from their power because all that territory, think about those eventually would become states, states filled with a lot of farmers who felt like would side with the Democratic Republicans. So because of that, the New England Federalists start talking about that secession. And this wouldn't be the first time that New England Federalists would talk about secession. So Burr, entering into a secret pact with the radical Federalists there, hatched this plan that he would win the governorship of New York. He would unite New York with the other New England states that were interested in secession, and then they would secede from the Union, creating a second country. So it's crazy. We tend to only think about the South and the Civil War and secession, but actually New England Federalists and New England as a whole talked about secession long before the South had talked about it later in 1860. Alexander Hamilton, remember, he hated Aaron Burr. And Burr ended up being defeated in this election in New York, along with the conspiracy. And again, Burr would be very, very upset about this. But also Hamilton would start sharing information and say, look, Aaron Burr was trying to lead this conspiracy against the U.S. government. And because of Hamilton accusing Burr of the conspiracy to destroy the Union, Burr at this point is really, really ticked off. He's boiling over in hatred for Hamilton and says, look, I'm done with this. And he challenges Hamilton to a duel. Now, many people believe that Hamilton actually wasn't interested in dueling. When they do fight and duel in this, Hamilton's shot goes very, very far over Burr's head. And many people believe that he was just there, was going to duel, miss the shot on purpose, and it was going to be done for. Burr, though, hated Hamilton, and his shot hit and would kill Alexander Hamilton. So you're going to see the Federalists' last great leader was dead, and Burr, who is still the sitting vice president at this time, is considered a villain to many. Where they had dueled at, it was actually legal to duel there, which is why I believe they had gone over into New Jersey where it was still legal to duel. So technically at this point, he wasn't a criminal, but Burr was seen as a villain to very, very many people. With this, I will say that even after Hamilton's death and the beef that him and Jefferson had, you will see that Jefferson greatly respected Hamilton as a politician. And in fact, if you ever get a chance to go to Monticello, when you go into the front door of Monticello, Jefferson in his main hall there has busts up of several different people. And one of the people that he has a bust up of there is of Alexander Hamilton. So while he very strongly disagreed with Hamilton's policy, he did respect Hamilton as a politician because Hamilton was a very, very good politician. So Burr kills Hamilton. Burr would move west to avoid any possible prosecution for the dueling there. He would eventually conspire with General James Wilkinson to either capture territory in the future Texas or try to establish Louisiana as a separate nation. So again, here goes Burr trying to create a new nation, which inevitably he'd probably be in charge of. I think Wilkinson may have realized, you know what, this probably isn't a great idea. And he would end up turning on Aaron Burr and arresting Aaron Burr. Burr would be brought back here to Virginia, and he would be brought to the Virginia Capitol. There, he would be acquitted of treason by John Marshall due to insufficient evidence against him. Actually, if you go to our Capitol Day and go into the old, what was the old Senate chambers there, you will actually see they have a plaque up there notating that that is where the trial of Aaron Burr happened. But he was found not guilty. And after this, you pretty much don't hear anything else really in history from Aaron Burr. So talking about Jefferson and his foreign policy, Jefferson would get us involved in what would be one of our first foreign wars during this time, and it would be the first Barbary War. In the 1790s, the Barbary pirates, who were these northern African pirates from the Barbary states of North Africa, they would raid merchant ships in the Mediterranean. And basically Europe and every country, in order to protect their ships that were going into the Mediterranean, they would pay these bribes to protect their vessels going into the Mediterranean. Jefferson, though, saw this as us giving up our national sovereignty, and he didn't like this whole idea of paying off bribes. So he refused to continue the practice. So what do the Barbary pirates start doing? They start raiding our ships. Jefferson responds by having the U.S. Navy retaliate. Now, the U.S. Navy would actually be very, very good in this retaliation and would have a lot of success. Unfortunately for Jefferson, one of the people that had been appointed to go over and try to work out some sort of peace with the Barbary pirates would jump to get peace too quickly and eventually give in a lot of concessions. And we'd end up paying a ransom to have some of our captives returned during this time, even though our military, working with some of the other African tribes that were opposed to the Barbary states, would have a lot of success over there in fighting. We would negotiate a settlement and pay a ransom. And a lot of historians say that the guy that was picked to go over there and kind of negotiate, he was way too quick to negotiate. When this could have actually played out a little bit more, and we could have gotten more and possibly ended all this Barbary pirate stuff that was happening over there. And there's several books. There's a good one written by Brian Kilmeade that talks about the first Barbary War and about our battles with the Tripoli pirates there in the Mediterranean. If you've ever heard the Marine Corps hymn, I'd sing it for you, but I am a terrible singer. But in the song, it says, "To the shores of Tripoli," and it is reference to the Battle of Derna. An army of 400 to 500 Africans led by 8 Marines and supported by the U.S. Navy from the sea would defeat an army of 4,000 Tripoli pirates there in northern Africa. And this would be the first land battle for the U.S. on foreign soil, and it would be the first time that you would see the U.S. flag hoisted over the old world. So I've got a flag, got a flag here. And again, this is going to be important because to this point in history, this flag had never been flown anywhere but in the United States and on U.S. soil. And for the first time, you're going to have Americans who are putting their flags on foreign soil. Other foreign policy issues that Jefferson would have to deal with, the Napoleonic Wars were still being fought. France and Britain were blockading ports, seizing ships of neutral nations, and forcing U.S. sailors into the military. We'll talk about that tomorrow with the War of 1812. But you're going to see a lot of Americans would blame the British for much of the issues in the Atlantic. You'd actually see the U.S. warship, the Chesapeake, would be fired on by a British ship off the coast of Virginia, and 3 Americans would be killed. And in response to that, you're going to see a lot of Americans start pushing for war. But Jefferson, remember earlier on that Jefferson probably would have been quick to side with the French in this. But I think he came to the point of realizing, like, we should try to use diplomacy instead. We're a very young nation, and we don't need to be getting involved in wars, which honestly we would have been in a disadvantage at. So with using diplomacy and his ideas, he would get pushed past the Embargo Act of 1807, which Congress would pass this act, which prohibited American merchant ships from sailing into any foreign ports. So effectively what it did is cut off all U.S. trade. Jefferson hoped that this would stop the British ships from messing with the U.S. ship. This embargo, though, to put it simply, would be absolutely horrendous and devastating to the U.S. economy. This would fail, and after the time of its implementation, you actually see that Jefferson would call for a repeal of this act at the end of his presidency, because, again, it absolutely did not work, and it hurt the U.S. economy, because if you think about it, that pretty much left us with having no one to trade with during this time. Jefferson thought it would put enough pressure on Britain and France that they would stop messing with our ships, especially Great Britain. Unfortunately, it did not do that. So You also have some documents here to look at from Jefferson's presidency. I think I did assign that for you guys to do. Otherwise, again, Jefferson, like I say, I always like to sum him up. His presidency would have great influence on the future of America, again, doubling the size of our country, but also his ideals of states' rights and a smaller federal government, which would be put into implementation and really be followed for quite a long time before you would start to see the federal government really to pick up and grow in power. So hope you enjoyed today learning a little bit about one of my favorite presidents, Thomas Jefferson. Otherwise, I hope you have a fantastic day.